Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches, where today I'm going to be talking about Paul Verhoeven's first English language release, the 1985 dark historical adventure slash softcore skin flick Flesh and Blood. Big content warning for sexual violence in this movie. Skip this video if you prefer not to hear about such stuff because it's very much a feature of the film and I'm going to have to address it. Okay, if you're still with me, the film is set in 1501 and begins with a group of mercenaries being hired by a nobleman named Arnolfini. It seems that a city in Arnolfini's domain has rebelled against him, and he needs the mercenaries' military muscle to win it back. In return for their assistance, he promises the mercenaries that they may have 24 hours in which to commit unrestrained looting and savagery within the city. In the event, however, Arnolfini suborns the mercenary leader Hawkwood. Hawkwood then betrays his own troops, working with Arnolfini's forces to eject the mercenaries from the city without their plunder. The embittered mercenary band elects a new leader, the deadly and ruthless Martin, and under his leadership, they plunder a caravan passing through Arnolfini's lands. Their goals are revenge against Arnolfini and recovery of their lost loot. The caravan contains many valuables, but they also pick up an unexpected prize. Agnes, the betrothed of Arnolfini's son Stephen. Martin rapes Agnes in front of all of his men and then claims her for his own. Agnes, for her part, seems to quickly adapt to the life of a freebooter's concubine and helps Martin and his men to infiltrate and conquer a small castle. Though unknown to the group, it is a castle whose inhabitants have been afflicted with the plague. Meanwhile, Stephen has learned of Agnes's capture and sets out to rescue her. Together with the reluctant Hawkwood, who he forces to assist him, he plans to besiege the castle, slay the mercenaries, and reclaim his bride-to-be. Thus, two ruthless men are set on a collision course with Agnes as the ostensible prize. But do either of them know where Agnes's loyalties actually lie? So Dutch director Paul Verhoeven began his career in his homeland, and along with his frequent leading man Rutger Hauer, soon came to international attention for his often confrontational and controversial films. Now, such fare may attract notice, but Verhoeven often struggled to get funding within the Netherlands, so he turned to Hollywood to finance his next planned project, which would go on to become this film. Now, it's safe to say that making Flesh and Blood was not, on the face of it, a positive experience for Verhoeven. The improvisational style he adopted for the filming process resulted in many delays and disagreements. One of the most notable of the latter was between the director and his longtime collaborator, Rutger Hauer. Hauer wanted to move into playing more heroic leading man type roles, which was deeply at odds with the tone Verhoeven was seeking. A bitter rift ensued, and though they had worked together multiple times over a more than 15-year period leading up to this, neither of these men would work with the other ever again. And after that difficult production, the film was a financial flop, recouping less than 2% of its budget at the box office. The film's financial failure caused Verhoeven to move to the United States in order to better understand American culture and what films would be suited to its audience. And given that his next three films were all big hits, it was a successful effort. But let's talk a little bit about why this movie misfired at the box office and whether or not I think it's worth seeing. So Paul Verhoeven himself has offered several theories as to why Flesh and Blood did not succeed with audiences, and the first of those was studio interference in the script. You see, all those American dollars Verhoeven secured to make the movie came with a price tag of their own. Orion Pictures insisted on some script changes. Specifically, they wanted a love interest added to the movie, and so Agnes, who is in the final film perhaps the most pivotal character of all, was introduced to the script only very late in the process. Verhoeven would later identify this as one of the reasons the film failed at the box office, saying that whereas the final movie focused on the shifting allegiances between Martin, Stephen, and Agnes, in retrospect, I think we should have stuck with Hawkwood and Martin. The failure of Flesh and Blood was a lesson for me. Never again compromise on the main storyline of a script. Now, I'm not convinced that Verhoeven is entirely right there on this particular issue. Specifically, it's not the introduction of Agnes that is the problem, I think. Her position within the story, simultaneously both hugely vulnerable but also pivotal and powerful, is potentially a very interesting one. I'm not convinced the execution comes off correctly, but the idea is sound. A bigger fundamental problem with the rewrite, to my mind, is Stephen. He's simply a not terribly interesting character, either in writing or, frankly, in the performance. Australian actor Tom Burlinson was at the time fresh off a couple of hit films here in his adopted homeland, but this movie quickly indicated the general direction his career would take going forward, which is, to say, not particularly great. Now, Verhoeven deliberately set out with the goal of depicting a much more grim and brutal vision of the late medieval period than he was typically seeing in film and television in the early 80s. He expressly wanted to show the early 16th century as a stinking time in which to live, and to portray everybody in the film as morally ambiguous. I think he missed the mark on the latter front. The characters in this movie aren't morally ambiguous. They're basically just flat out awful human beings. Arnolfini is greedy and treacherous. It seems likely his city had good reason to try and throw off his rule. And his betrayal of the mercenaries kicks off this entire situation. Martin is a rapist and a hired killer. Stephen kidnaps a young woman to blackmail Hawkwood into helping him rescue Agnes. And Agnes, for her part, is in some ways even more mercenary than the mercenaries. She's always got her eye on where the power lies and will do almost anything to keep her on its side. As one academic succinctly put it, Flesh and Blood has no hero to root for and no happy fantasy element to lighten its unpleasantly realistic depiction of the period. And Verhoeven himself acknowledged that he overdid the bleakness, saying that the film was too cynical and downbeat to be a hit. And I think there is definitely merit in that statement. This is a very unpleasant film, which brings me to my final point, which is, as I intimated earlier, there's a lot of nudity in this film, both male and female, and both sexual and non-sexual. And there's also a lot of sex, and perhaps most significantly in terms of things likely to put people off, there's a lot of sexual violence. Early on in the film, we have the rampage of the triumphant mercenaries through the conquered city, raping and killing as they go. Then later we see Martin rape Agnes in front of his baying, cheering followers, all of whom expect to repeat having their own turn in assaulting Agnes once Martin is done. Now, Agnes manages to save herself and the audience from further violation by anyone than Martin. But even so, this scene is graphic and confronting and will absolutely put off some people from watching this movie. Now, it's true that if your film depicts sexual violence, then depicting that violence as a terrible thing is absolutely the right thing to do, because assaults like this are awful, reprehensible acts. Unfortunately, while Martin's attack on Agnes is depicted as the violent act it is, the script's chosen method for Agnes to win Martin's protection is to simulate pleasure in his assault. And while I believe it is intended to be simulated pleasure and that the audience is supposed to understand that this is all a desperate stratagem by Agnes to minimize the violence she must suffer, I'm not sure that the film is sufficiently explicit about that fact, and some people may well misinterpret. Now, usually I'm very much an advocate for movies trusting their audience and not overly lampshading the narrative point they're trying to make. But no rule is applicable 100% of the time. Sometimes it's a good idea to break the rules, and I think this is one of those rare occasions where a little less trust and a bit more blatancy might have been the right call. Flesh and Blood is a bold film, and it's gone on to considerable cult success as a result of its boldness, but I think there are good reasons it did not win a large audience, and it will most definitely not be to all tastes. Next time, from one movie that deliberately pushed the envelope to another, though this one was made over 50 years earlier. It's Maniac, also known as Sex Maniac, from way, way back in 1934. It's widely been described as one of the worst movies ever made, but it also has an 89% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. We'll talk about why that is next time. In the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you've seen Flesh and Blood, let me know what you thought of it.